Hey everyone, welcome to It Girl in Review, where we dive deep into the world of classic TV shows and movies. Today, we're traveling back to 1984 to revisit the very first episode of the iconic series Murder She Wrote. So grab your magnifying glass, put on your best detective hat, and let's solve this mystery together, shall we? By the way, I'm watching this on Amazon Prime through a VPN with location being USA, just in case you guys wanted to know. First things first, let's talk about the star of the show, the legendary Angela Lansbury, who brings the beloved character Jessica Fletcher to life. Jessica is a retired school teacher turned best selling mystery novelist who somehow finds herself solving real life murders. She's like a mix of Miss Marple and Sherlock Holmes, with a dash of that nosy neighbor who always knows what's going on. Now, rewatching and listening to this series, keep in mind that this is all being aired in 1984, and at that time in the US, segregation was still very apparent. So assume all of the characters are either white/Caucasian and heterosexual, and that's mostly all that appears in this series. I will let you know of all of the outliers if they pop out throughout the show. So let's put on our 1984 brain and go for gold. Now let's break down the plot, the characters, and all the juicy details. The first mystery is split into 2 episodes. FYI, in these episodes, most of the characters are wealthy and 40 plus. In episode 1, titled The Murder of Sherlock Holmes, this is the pilot where we are introduced to Jessica Fletcher, a recent widow who lives in Cabot Cove, Maine. Jessica is a widow and substitute teacher who becomes a mystery book author thanks to her nephew Grady Fletcher. Grady submits his aunt's manuscript to the publishing company he works for, who ends up loving it and publishes it immediately. It is a bestseller, and Jessica goes to New York City to promote her new book. While in New York, Jessica goes on a press junket, and it goes from good to bad. From numerous TV shows where presenters are pessimistic and passive aggressive, to radio hosts lacking couth and looking for gossip, to random people serving her with a subpoena. As you can already understand, small town Jessica is over the Big Apple and decides to take the train back home to Cabot Cove, Maine. And that's when Grady, a woman assistant Kitty Donovan, and Jessica's publisher, Preston Giles, played by Arthur Hill, bombard her with the reasons to why she should stay in NYC and come to a party over the weekend at Preston Giles' estate in the country of New Holvang, which is a fictional upstate community of wealthy New Yorkers. This is where he said she could meet real people that aren't critics or columnists. She agrees to stay longer after his sweet talkin'. In the next scene, you see Jessica and Mr. Giles driving to his house and discussing the subpoena whilst exchanging pleasantries. Next, we are introduced to the dynamic of Caleb McCallum, aka the Captain, and his wife Louise McCallum, as they are already at Mr. Giles' estate while practicing clay target shooting. Minutes later, Jessica Fletcher and Louise get introduced by way of Mr. Giles. Louise politely confronts Mr. Giles and asks if he knew that Caleb invited the assistant with the loose walk, Ashley Vickers. By this, we can already tell Ashley is somewhat romantically involved with Louise's husband, Caleb. That conversation ceases when a loud boom makes Jessica, who was standing in front of them still, ask, "What was that noise?" They inform her it's a sonic boom from the nearby airport. Now, okay guys, pause this for a second. So with the sonic boom noise, my algorithm was algorithming. The other day, a creator was detailing express flights that used to be available back in the 70s and 80s for shorter time frames. For example, a flight from New York to London would only take 3 hours, but in order for that to happen, the planes would need to be traveling super fast, which would involve a loud sonic boom. For the plane to get off in a fast enough speed, which means it would be moving faster than the sound, which in turn creates that loud sonic boom noise. It's been previously discontinued for commercial use due to the extremely loud continuous noise for the passengers and the dangers of going that fast. Continuing on, Louise then asks Jessica what she's coming as later that night. Realizing he forgot to mention, Mr. Giles lets her know the party that's happening is actually a costume party where everyone is coming as their favorite fictional character. Stressed, thinking what to do, Jessica jokingly tells him she could always come as Lady Godiva as a reference to coming to the party nude. In the evening, the party kicks off and the estate's butler opens the door to Peter Pan, Shakespeare, and a turkey? Jessica comes down the stairs to meet Mr. Giles dressed as Cinderella's godmother in this gorgeous costume, conveniently whipped up last minute with the help of her new friend Louise McCallum. I mean, how perfect is that? Mr. Giles dressed as... I'm actually not sure. To me, he looked like some type of Shakespearean character, but a lot of these characters were hard to guess, honestly. Anyways, Mr. Giles tries to seduce Jessica with his words, but is quickly interrupted by another character, Arnold, who is dressed as Humpty Dumpty, whom wants to introduce himself to Jessica as well. Next, we get introduced to the infamous assistant of Caleb McCallum, Miss Ashley Vickers, who for the first time waltzes into the scene dressed as a sexy evil queen and exchanges jokes with a new character, Peter, who is playing the piano beautifully, dressed as maybe Mozart? Peter then asks another character, whom is black, with a black wife. They have no name here, barely any lines, and are dressed as French aristocrats, by the way. But the man is called Doctor and is asked if they have any musical requests for the piano. The black doctor is tipsy and says he loves everything Peter, aka Mozart, plays. And this is where we find out info about Peter, whom was putting together an off-Broadway show himself. Then in walks Mr. Sherlock Holmes himself, aka Caleb McCallum. The party continues, and then Caleb is seen by Ashley, his assistant, fondling another woman, Little Red Riding Hood. Cut to the scene where Grady, Jessica's nephew, who is dressed as Robin Hood, is walking with the woman assistant Kitty Donovan in the dark romantically outside. She has a jacket around her, so I can't tell what her costume is. All of a sudden, Grady notices that someone is in the room he is staying in the upstairs bedroom, shining a light they can see from outside. Grady storms in the house, rushes past Jessica upstairs, fights the intruder that obviously isn't the real character for the fight scene, but a badly disguised stunt double for this action scene. The intruder tries to escape but is tripped by Jessica in the hallway. Also, not sure in this scene if Grady also had a stunt double or not, just couldn't tell. This whole fight scene is very 80s bad action and camp, but since we're in 1984, this is entertaining. The intruder, after being caught, gets questioned in the office of Mr. Giles. In that office, while the intruder sits, are Mr. Giles himself, Jessica Fletcher, aka Cinderella's godmother, her nephew Grady, aka Robin Hood, and lastly, Kitty Donovan, who now I see is dressed as a belly dancer. His name is Dexter Baxendale, and he's a real-life private investigator hired by a very influential individual to conduct a discreet investigation and lets them know he's not at liberty to say why he is even investigating at this particular party. Mr. Giles tries then to call the local police, and before he can, the PI lets him know whether the police are called or not. He still won't disclose his source. But Mr. Giles should know that if Mr. Giles calls, he will leak the story to the local newspaper and let them get a hold of the story. The suspicion of guilt will point at each of his guests equally, and whichever one is under investigation will be outed. Mr. Giles reluctantly hangs up and tells Grady to escort P.I. Dexter out of the house through the back. As he is being escorted out of the office, after looking at his desk statue of a blindfolded Lady Justice, the P.I. Dexter turns around and weirdly says to Mr. Giles, and I quote, forgive me, but ever since I entered this room, I've been trying to deduce who you're dressed as, and I think I have it. It's Edmond Dante, isn't it? The Count of Monte Cristo. And which Mr. Giles replies in agreement, very good, Mr. Baxendale. I'm almost sorry I'm throwing you out. You might have made a charming guest. So now we know Mr. Giles' costume, because I was clueless. After that scene, we're back at the party with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, aka Caleb McCallum, who's grabbing seafood with the black doctor and Jessica. As Caleb talks snooty about his knowledge on seafood, his wife Louise, who has been MIA at this party, stumbles into the scene as she is drunk and tells him that she's over it and she wants to go home. Caleb tries to reason with her to stay, but she isn't budging. So Caleb tells her he isn't leaving. In this angle, you can see Ashley, Caleb's assistant, who, if you remember, is assumed to be romantically involved with him. She and others can be seen eavesdropping on the McCallum's convo, and she is smirking as the wife Louise tells Caleb, "Well, I'm leaving and you and Ashley can do whatever it is you do." As Louise tries to leave the party, Jessica tries to stop Louise from drunk driving to no avail, and then her nephew Grady comes in exhausted from escorting the PI Dexter out and away. Jessica asks Grady to try to get the keys from Louise and drive her home before she gets to the car. So he tries to reason with Louise, but she is drunk and pushes Grady to the ground and then drives away. Next, it cuts to the scene in the party where Arnold, aka Humpty Dumpty, is talking to Peter, aka Mozart, at the bar about how expensive his tickets for Peter's off-Broadway play are, the tickets being $30. Which is about $90 in today's money, very cheap to me. Which to me is crazy because they are all upper middle class to wealthy at this party, and with connections, might I add. But Humpty is definitely a penny pincher. Peter tells Humpty to stop complaining because he paid $250,000 to upstart this off-Broadway project. Now again, for reference, $250,000 back in 1984 is about $756,000 today in 2024, which again is a steal to start production for that little. Next, Jessica and the assistant Kitty Donovan walk into the scene. Peter, aka Mozart, starts singing a tune, and in walks Ashley, Caleb's romantic assistant as well. Peter stops the song amidst saying something inappropriate that he thought would make Ashley embarrassed. And she basically tells him, "Oh, don't stop because of me. My relationship with Caleb has been strictly business for the past several months." So let me add, with this 1984 acting, I'm not sure what I should infer from her saying that, because she says this in a dry manner and her face was blank and no one else in the room reacted to it. Maybe she's being truthful then? Well, I hope they address this later in the episode. Peter, in the same moment, humorously asks Ashley, "Where is Caleb McCallum right now anyways?" And the others, excluding Jessica, are like, "Oh yeah, none of us have seen him in like an hour either." Ashley shadily informs them that they haven't seen Little Red Riding Hood either. So y'all remember he was caressing the backside of an unknown actor dressed as Little Red Riding Hood, right? Therefore, Ashley is implying that no one has seen Caleb, aka Sherlock Holmes, because he is with Little Red Riding Hood, being naughty. In the same breath, with Ashley being a little snarky, she spills the champagne she's been drinking onto her costume. Jessica immediately springs into action to help her get the dress clean before the stain sets in. They go into the kitchen together with Jessica leading the way, and as they get to the kitchen, Mr. Giles is ending a phone call with a persistent reporter from the New York Times. The person who wants to interview Jessica Monday morning. Remember y'all, Mr. Giles is the head of a publishing company that works with Jessica, so he tells her that he got rid of him since he knows she doesn't want to deal with the media stuff for a while. So, at the same time, Jessica continues to grab ingredients for Ashley's stain that is apparently an old Fletcher family concoction. Ashley tries to tell Jessica it's not a big deal, but Jessica is persistent and tells her it's no worries and leads Ashley upstairs to a bedroom where they can handle the stain on her dress privately. As they are all leaving the kitchen, Mr. Giles is stopped by Peter Pan, who is trying to convince Peter, aka Mozart, to play a good tune on the piano. Peter begrudgingly agrees, and he heads to the piano with an excited Peter Pan to play for other guests. Peter, aka Mozart, sits on the piano and lets all the other guests know he will only stay playing until 4 a.m., so tell him your requests now, and the guests cheer. Right after this, the camera pans to a close-up of an old Roman numeral clock that reads about 11:15 p.m. Cut to the next day as the same clock shows it's about 6 a.m. in the morning now, and the butler is cleaning the house from the costume party's mess. Sleeping on a fancy lounge chair is Arnold, aka Humpty Dumpty. Jessica is outside doing a morning run around Mr. Giles' estate and runs into Louise McCallum driving back into the estate hungover, coming to pick up her husband Caleb, aka Sherlock Holmes. She asks Jessica if he slept there last night. Jessica tells Louise that she can't recall, and Louise replies in a matter of fact tone that it's okay, she knows who he was with last night, but he usually has the decency to come home. Then, all of a sudden, you hear a blood curdling scream from the assistant Kitty Donovan. The scream is coming from the pool. Jessica runs over to the assistant to see what the commotion is about, but Kitty can't form words, and Jessica goes closer to the pool entrance and sees into frame and sees someone face down floating in the pool. At first, I didn't realize who it was until Louise came to frame to see and she yells in disbelief Caleb's name. After putting two and two together along with the costume of the floating victim, I realized it was none other than Sherlock Holmes, aka Caleb McCallum, floating in the pool, dead. Side note, can we talk about this scene where they discover the body for a second? If you've seen this episode, this part is very theatrical. It has strict set direction. I can't explain it, but it's very peculiar and not natural. But again, my mind needs to remember this is the 80s, and this is natural and normal for theater type TV segments at that time. The next scene is the ambulance taking the body away, and the police officer named Jim is talking on his radio, letting them know some important information. Officer Jim says the person in the pool was Caleb McCallum, the seafood guy, and that the chief won't let his wife Louise see him to identify the body because Caleb got his face blown off by a 12 gauge, aka a shotgun. Cut to the scene with Chief Roy Gunderson in the living room with the main suspects to figure out some important details. The presumed suspects in that room are Grady Fletcher, aka Robin Hood, Caleb's assistant Ashley Vickers, aka Sexy Evil Queen, the butler everyone ignores who's in and out doing guest duties, the black doctor, Mr. Giles, aka Mozart, and Louise McCallum, the wife. Chief Roy tells them this is obviously a murder and apologizes because his questions will seem blunt. He repeats to them that he's found out that the body was discovered at about 6 a.m. by Kenny Donovan, whom was in the room upstairs resting now after being given a sedative by the black doctor. Chief Roy asks him, even though he isn't a coroner, but he did take a look at the body, and from the top of his head, how long would he have guessed the body had been dead? The doctor tells him several hours. The chief explains, regardless, Sherlock Holmes was still killed the other night, maybe even while the party was still going on, and he asks if they are sure nobody heard a shot from a 12-gauge shotgun. They all say no, and Mr. Giles lets it be known that the party was noisy and the windows were closed because of the cold weather, and the pool is some distance from the house where the party was. Chief Roy frustratedly asks Mr. Giles what happened at his house then, because there was a murder and he's looking for the motive. Mr. Giles replies, motive for killing Caleb? Surely you jest. By the way, surely you jest means you must be joking. Peter, aka Mozart, continues saying half the country had reason to kill him, and the other half didn't know him. Ashley, Caleb's assistant, agrees and says, well, Caleb was not well loved, but none of them had reason to kill him. Then Louise, Caleb's wife, interjects and says, except for me, in response to Ashley. Because that's kind of what they were all thinking Louise believes. But she tells them all that she didn't kill her husband, at least she doesn't think. All she remembers is driving drunkenly away from the estate and then waking up at sunrise in the car next to the lake. She doesn't remember anything else, it's all blank. Now, while this questioning is happening, they see Jessica Fletcher from the window walking around outside in the garden area, looking for something and walking back and forth from the window throughout the indoor questioning of the group. The chief, finally confused with what Jessica is doing, tells everyone in the room to stay on the premises until he says otherwise, and he goes outside to check on what Jessica is doing. Chief Roy finds Jessica climbing a fence looking for clues. He stops her and she comes down and lets him know she didn't even disturb anything. He tells her he read her book, but that he just read it, not that he liked it. She's confused by the statement, but before she can say anything, Chief Roy, out of the blue, asks for her opinion on the murder situation because she knows people, and he sees the little things and inconsistencies. While she is stuck on all of what he said to her, he asks her opinion on Caleb's wife, Louise. Jessica replies that she's not a suspect, is she? And the chief tells her at that moment Louise is actually the prime suspect. Jessica is surprised by this and asks if he was informed by Mr. Giles about last night's intruder, aka P.I. Dexter. He knows about it and is still confused by Jessica bringing up the P.I. Chief Roy asks her if she thinks P.I. Dexter killed Caleb, aka Sherlock Holmes. She tells him no, she doesn't think that, but asks if he noticed the shoes on the body floating in the swimming pool. Chief Roy says, "Shoes?" in a confused tone. Jessica continues that at last night's party, that Caleb McCallum, aka Sherlock Holmes, was wearing black patent leather, highly polished shoes. Chief Roy is writing what she says down because now he thinks she's onto something. Jessica continues that since P.I. Dexter was discovered on the second floor in Grady's room, that he had to have gotten in by climbing the fence she was just on to get up there. She shows him the broken plant in the garden and the footprint in the dirt next to the fence. Jessica continues telling Chief Roy that P.I. to climb up the ladder, he had to have been wearing soft rubber-soled shoes. Chief Roy, trying to piece what she told him together, asks her if she's telling him that the guy in the pool was not actually Caleb McCallum? And in comes the twist. Before Jessica can answer Chief Roy, Caleb McCallum walks into frame alive in regular clothes and hungover and tells them it sure as hell wasn't him. Both shocked and speechless, Caleb goes on to insult Chief Roy while walking towards them, letting him know how incompetent he is at his job. Chief Roy says if that's how he feels, then he can explain to them who the heck is in that pool and why the person was wearing the Sherlock Holmes costume. Caleb tells him he has no clue, and then his wife Louise interrupts, who is shocked and overwhelmed. She runs over to make sure he is really there and hugs him happily, and then slaps him and tells him that that's for the last nights and all the nights he put her through. The next scene is the garden area. With Caleb, Jessica, Chief Roy, and Mr. Giles, Caleb starts out by telling them that he hired P.I. Dexter and asks if it was the P.I. that was in the pool. Chief Roy informs that that's who Jessica thinks it is, but they're waiting on fingerprints to confirm. Chief Roy then asks Caleb what we all have been wanting to know. What exactly was P.I. Dexter doing there? Caleb vaguely says that he was concerned because someone has been leaking confidential information, so he hired the PI to find out who it was. And Friday before the party, he told Caleb that he was onto something and would tie it all together that weekend. Mr. Giles asks where he was this whole time and why the PI was wearing his costume. Caleb tries to skirt around the subject and says he was out all night, and maybe he ran into Little Red Riding Hood from earlier in the night, but he didn't know her, and after a few looks, he tells the truth, that he was actually with the woman all night. They all look awkwardly away. I personally think they were awkward about it because this was still a time when public infidelity was frowned upon heavily. Anyways, Mr. Giles asks Caleb again how the PI got the Sherlock Holmes costume on, and Caleb tells them he really doesn't know. He took the costume off before leaving to the motel with the woman because he didn't want to look like, and I quote, a refugee from a costume ball, end quote. Now remember y'all, this was the 80s and they were ignorant even within television. Anyways, the investigation of the house ends for now and everyone is allowed to go back to their everyday lives. Mr. Giles walks Jessica to the private driver he got to take her back to her hotel in the city. As he is talking to her, she gets in and looks at something out of view in a concerning manner. Mr. Giles asks if everything is okay, and she comes back to what he was asking and he tells her she seems distracted in the moment. He apologizes about the weekend because he promised her fun and relaxation, but in the end, it ended in murder. She tells him it's just so easy writing about murder, but the reality is a different thing. She then looks back at the thing that got her distracted moments prior and almost tells Mr. Giles something and then tells him never mind. Then she drives off. While in the car, she is thinking heavily about something, but before the driver leaves the gate, Chief Roy gets the driver to stop and hops in with Jessica and asks the driver to drop him off at the local department headquarters. Jessica is smart and asks Chief Roy if his car broke down or something. He tells her no, he just wants to have a private chat and asks her what's wrong because he can tell she is thinking heavily about something. She hesitates to tell him, but he pushes her to be honest with him about her possible theory. Jessica looks Chief Roy in the eye and tells him that someone killed Sherlock Holmes. He is confused and tries to tell her, well, no, that PI was an idiot and doesn't compare to the Sherlock Holmes. Jessica then corrects herself and rephrases to tell him again that he was Sherlock Holmes up until the moment he was killed, but she also wondered if the killer knew who he was. Chief Roy is still confused, so Jessica rephrases again and tells him that he's investigating the murder of a PI. So suppose the killer didn't know that it was the PI Dexter. Suppose the killer thought that it was Caleb in that Sherlock Holmes costume, because Caleb was the one seen wearing the Sherlock Holmes costume all night. Finally, Chief Roy's brain starts working, and he puts pieces together and rephrases what Jessica said. He exclaims, okay then, we have two possible victims, two possible suspects, depending on who the killer thought he was killing. And Jessica, after guiding Chief Roy to this conclusion, agrees to his theory. Now, after everyone is back in the Big Apple and the public finds out about the murder, the newspaper reports about Caleb McCallum's infidelity, but a few facts are narrated from the paper by Grady, Jessica's nephew, which was that Caleb checked into the inn shortly after 10:30 p.m., the night of the party/murder, and that Caleb is a fast food giant and owns a whole company. Grady then tells her that he wonders who the PI was spying on, and that whoever he was spying on is probably the killer. He then tells her he believes she can solve this, but she tells him that's a job for the police, and that she's ready to go home whilst she's already packing because she doesn't like the city life. Besides Grady and the assistant Kitty, she doesn't feel the need to ever come back. He brings up Mr. Giles as a reason for her to stay because he could tell they had a connection with each other. He tells her to at least call him and tell him that she's leaving firsthand, but she has no rebuttal for that and just reinforces her wanting to go back home to Cabot Cove and that she'll call Mr. Giles from there. She then lets Grady know that she knows what he was doing, trying to set her up with Mr. Giles in the first place. He apologizes and lets her know he's sorry they didn't hit it off, but in a saddened way, Jessica tells her nephew Grady, well, that's the problem, they were beginning to hit it off far too well. The next scene, Jessica is at the train station ready to go home. She sees the black train conductor named Daniel at her train, and he of course helps her get her bags to the train. Hey, at least Daniel has a name instead of his job title as a moniker. Anyways, while Jessica and Daniel are walking to her cabin, Kitty Donovan, the assistant, and the one that originally found Sherlock Holmes in the pool, comes yelling for Jessica to come quick because Jessica's nephew, Grady, has been arrested for suspicion of murder. Jessica rushes to the police department where Grady is being held. The next scene happens in Chief Roy's office. Chief Roy lets her know that Grady has been stealing confidential information from the company, and he is being questioned by county detectives that believe he did it. Jessica is confused why Chief Roy isn't doing the questioning, and he lets her know that it's a matter of jurisdiction, and when it comes to murder, the county cops take over. He lets her know that at 6 a.m. this morning, they found P.I. Dexter's car parked about a half a mile or 0.8 kilometers from Mr. Giles' estate. In the glove department, they found a confidential real estate report that Caleb McCallum told them was worth $300,000 or $400,000 in the wrong hands. It was stolen from his office early Friday morning. Confused, Jessica asks, they are sure he's the thief? He tells her that Grady had access, and Jessica replies, so does Ashley, Caleb's romantic assistant. Chief Roy lets Jessica know that she's being questioned right now as well, but that P.I. Dexter was found in Grady's room. Jessica questions if that makes Grady the killer then, and Chief Roy replies no, but it makes him a pretty good suspect. Jessica then argues that P.I. Dexter could have been in Grady's room by accident and that the first floor's bathroom was out of order and that people were up and down the staircase all night, and ends with P.I. Dexter could have ducked into Grady's room to avoid being seen. Chief Roy realizes she's right, and he's been backed into another possibility. She continues, if Grady was the thief, then his fingerprints would have been all over the real estate report. He replies with, they checked the report, fingerprints are all smudged. Jessica's last point was asking if Chief Roy bothered to check the bank accounts to see if that money even ended up in Grady's account. She knows it's a small lead. Before more debating can further, Mr. Giles barges into Chief Roy's office and tells Jessica that Grady has been released thanks to Mr. Giles' lawyer, Carl. Chief Roy states to Mr. Giles that that's a high-priced legal talent, and Mr. Giles states to Chief Roy, would he rather they leave it to some lousy state lawyer that is biased in favor of cops? He has a point. Now, the next scene happens at a diner-style restaurant near the police department, where Mr. Giles and Jessica meet up with Grady and Kitty. Mr. Giles tells Grady at the table that his lawyer Carl said it's not looking too good for Grady and that the P.I. Dexter had a reputation for being a cheap blackmailer, and that the police think that the P.I. got some dirt on Grady and came to the party to confront him and extort him for a payoff. The lawyer also told Mr. Giles that the police think that P.I. Dexter took the Sherlock Holmes costume out of the front closet where Caleb left it so he could mingle and lure Grady out to the pool area. But the police then think that Grady lost his temper and shot him with a shotgun. Jessica interjects and says it's nonsense unless P.I. Dexter was a mind reader, because how would he have known that the Sherlock Holmes costume was in the front closet to begin with? Grady agrees and reminds everyone at the table that there must be a reason P.I. Dexter put on the costume and dressed like that. Jessica agrees and says once they can figure out that answer, they will then know who did it. Jessica changes avenues and asks them if it could be Ashley, the assistant that stole the reports. Kitty thinks it's a big possibility because basically Ashley was a low-level unskilled worker at the company, and then all of a sudden Ashley and Caleb McCallum are sleeping about in hotel rooms all over the city. But lately Kitty says the last few months Ashley gets frozen out, not from her job of course, but she got replaced by another woman and is no longer the assistant/mistress, which Kitty thinks that's definitely a motive for stealing the real estate report. As this gossip from Kitty is happening, Jessica notices Ashley, the one they are talking about, walk into the restaurant on the other side. Jessica leaves the table and convo to make her way to talk to Ashley herself. Before we get into Jessica and Ashley, I think we have our earlier question answered. Ashley and Caleb were definitely intimately involved. So now Jessica and Ashley are talking. She tells Ashley there could be strength in numbers after being interrogated. She blatantly tells Ashley that police are convinced that either she or Grady murdered the PI, but Ashley interjects about that fact and tells Jessica that the police have pinpointed the time of death to about 11:15 p.m., as Mr. Giles' neighbors heard a loud noise at that time. The neighbors didn't think to look into it because they originally assumed it was a sonic boom from the nearby airport. After being told this, the police investigated and found there were no overhead jets that Saturday night. Therefore, the sonic boom the neighbors heard was that of a shotgun. She lastly reminds Jessica that she has an ironclad alibi thanks to her. Because if you remember, at the time of the murder, Ashley was in the upstairs bedroom half undressed while Jessica was trying to wash out the champagne stain out of Ashley's costume. And that, my friends, is the end of part 1 of the pilot episode, The Murder of Sherlock Holmes. Overall, this first episode sets the tone perfectly for what becomes a legendary series. The blend of cozy mystery, clever writing, and the always impressive Angela Lansbury makes for an irresistible combination. It's no wonder the show ran for 12 seasons and spawned several TV movies. So, before we leave, let's go over the important details. The time of death was 11:15 p.m. Saturday night. Location of death was the pool, which was far from the house party. The windows were closed because of cold weather and the music was loud and noisy. Peter, aka Mozart, was seen playing the piano right before 11:15 p.m. Jessica, Caleb's assistant Ashley, were upstairs with the stain at 11:15 p.m. as well. Now, some questions we should ask. Was the PI Dexter the target in this murder, or was it Caleb McCallum, who was the original person wearing the Sherlock Holmes costume? Why was PI Dexter wearing Sherlock Holmes' costume in the first place? Who was feeding confidential information to PI Dexter? Who stole the real estate report for PI Dexter? Now, the remaining suspects without an alibi are the butler, Preston Giles, Arnold, aka Humpty Dumpty, Kenny Donovan, Louise McCallum, aka Caleb's wife, and Grady Fletcher. Now, who do you think did it and why? Let's see if you are correct with part 2 next week at the same time. Share, like, and follow, and leave a review if you can. Thanks for tuning in to It Girl and Review by Jay Gibson, me. Follow the episodes with me on your streaming platforms of choice or just TikTok. See y'all next week for part 2 of The Murder of Sherlock Holmes. Ciao!